He's trying to tell me something, and I don't think it wants to stay buried. The rain came down in thin, cold sheets, tapping against the jagged rocks like restless fingers, and Daniel Hayes stood at the edge of the land he never asked for, boots sinking half an inch into the mud with every step as the wind dragged through the canyon and carried that hollow, low sound he couldn't quite place, not wind, not water, something deeper, something that echoed. Rex didn't bark, not once, not even when thunder rolled across the sky. Instead the German shepherd stood rigid, ears pinned forward, eyes locked on a stretch of rock no different from the rest, except he wouldn't move, wouldn't blink, wouldn't leave it alone, his claws scraping against the surface with a steady, desperate rhythm that cut through the storm like a signal, and Daniel exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand across his jaw, telling himself it was nothing, just instinct, just a dog chasing shadows in a place too quiet for its own good. But Rex didn't chase shadows, not like this, not with that low, warning growl vibrating in his chest like he was standing guard over something unseen. The land stretched for acres, a forgotten inheritance buried between ridges and scrub brush, the kind of place people called worthless because it couldn't be built on, couldn't be farmed, couldn't be sold for anything but a loss, just a useless hole in the rocks. That's what the letter had said, and Daniel almost laughed when he first read it, almost threw it away, but something about it felt unfinished, like a sentence that stopped too soon, and now here he was, standing in the middle of it, rain soaking through his jacket, watching his dog dig at a wall that didn't make sense. Rex, he called out, firm but calm, the same tone he'd used overseas, the tone that meant stand down, the tone that usually worked, but this time Rex didn't even turn his head, just kept scraping, faster now, more urgent. Dirt and small stones scattering across the ground as if time was running out for something only he understood. Daniel stepped closer, boots crunching over loose gravel, and for a moment the world narrowed to the sound of claws against stone and the steady beat of his own breathing, in, out, controlled, but something in his chest tightened anyway, that old feeling, the one he couldn't shake since coming home, the sense that danger didn't always announce itself, that sometimes it waited, silent and patient, just behind a surface you hadn't thought to question. Lightning flashed, sharp and white, and for a split second the rock face lit up in full detail, and that's when Daniel saw it. Not clearly, not all at once, just a line. Too straight, too clean, cutting across the uneven surface like a scar that didn't belong, and his breath caught before he could stop it. Rex froze, paw pressed flat against the stone, head tilted slightly as if listening, and then he let out a low, deliberate whine, not fear, not pain, something else, something closer to insistence. Daniel reached out, fingers brushing the wet rock, tracing that line again, and the moment his hand settled there, he felt it, not movement, not vibration, just a difference, a hollow stillness behind the surface that shouldn't have been there at all, and suddenly the rain didn't matter, the cold didn't matter, the land wasn't empty anymore, because whatever was sealed behind that wall had been waiting long before he arrived, and somehow, for reasons he didn't yet understand, it had just been found. Daniel did not pull his hand away right away, even as the rain soaked through his sleeve and ran down to his wrist, cold and steady, because what he felt beneath his palm did not match what his eyes told him should be there, and that mismatch settled into his chest like a quiet weight. Rex shifted beside him, pacing in a tight half-circle, then returning to the exact same spot as if an invisible line held him there. His nails tapping once against the rock before he sat, not relaxed, not calm, but waiting, watching Daniel instead of the wall now, as if the next move belonged to him. It is just a seam, Daniel said under his breath, more to himself than to the dog, his voice low and controlled, the way he used to steady his thoughts when things did not line up, but even as he said it, he knew seams in rock did not run that straight, did not cut across uneven stone with that kind of quiet precision, and they certainly did not sound hollow when you pressed against them. He knocked once with his knuckles, a simple test, the kind any homeowner might do, but the sound that came back was wrong, not the dull, solid thud of earth and stone, but something thinner, something that echoed just enough to make his jaw tighten. Rex stood immediately, tail stiff, ears forward again, a soft sound escaping him, not quite a bark, not quite a whine. Something in between, something that felt like urgency held just below the surface. Daniel stepped back, eyes scanning the rest of the rock face, tracing the edges, looking for anything that would explain it away, any natural break, any sign of erosion, but the more he looked, the more that single line stood out, too deliberate, too intentional, like it had been placed there rather than formed. The wind shifted, carrying a faint smell of wet stone and something older, something stale that did not belong in open air, and Daniel felt that familiar tension return, the one that had followed him home from places he tried not to remember, the sense that something hidden was about to be uncovered whether he was ready or not. "All right," he said quietly, exhaling through his nose, grounding himself in the present, boots planted, shoulders squared. "We take a closer look," and this time when he moved, Rex moved with him. Step for step, no hesitation, no distraction, Daniel crouched, brushing away loose dirt along the base of the wall, fingers working through mud and gravel until he found it again, that same unnatural edge, and this time he followed it downward, slower, more careful, until it curved just slightly and disappeared beneath a thin layer of packed soil. He paused, glancing over his shoulder at the empty stretch of land behind him, nothing but open space and distant ridgelines fading into gray, no houses, no roads close enough to matter, just isolation, the kind that made every sound feel louder and every silence feel deeper. Rex let out a short, sharp breath, then leaned forward and began to dig again, faster now, sending damp earth scattering as his focus narrowed to that buried section, and Daniel did not stop him this time, did not call him off, because part of him needed to see what the dog already seemed to know. Minutes passed, or maybe longer, time stretching in that strange way it did when attention locked onto a single point, until the packed soil gave way enough to reveal more of the line, and with it, something else, something that made Daniel's hands still mid-motion. Metal, not much, just a sliver at first, dark and worn, but unmistakably not stone. Not natural, and definitely not supposed to be there. The rain softened, fading into a light drizzle that tapped gently against the ground, and in that quiet, Daniel reached out again, brushing away the remaining dirt until the edge of what looked like a buried frame came into view, cold under his fingers, solid, deliberate. Rex stopped digging and stepped back, sitting once more, eyes fixed on Daniel with that same intense focus, as if waiting for him to understand what had already been found. Daniel swallowed slowly, his throat dry despite the damp air, and for a moment he did nothing, just stared at the line, at the metal, at the impossible shape of something hidden where nothing should have been, and then he said, barely above a whisper, "This was built," and the words did not echo off the rocks the way he expected, they seemed to settle into them instead, as if the land itself had been holding on to that truth, waiting for someone to finally say it out loud. Daniel did not move for a long second after the word left his mouth, as if saying it had made everything more real than he was prepared for, and the quiet that followed felt heavier than the storm had moments before, pressing in from all sides. Rex remained seated, perfectly still, his gaze locked on the exposed edge of metal, his chest rising and falling in slow, controlled breaths that matched Daniel's own rhythm almost exactly, as if the two of them had fallen into the same unspoken understanding. Daniel reached forward again, this time more carefully, fingers tracing along the metal line until he felt a slight break, a corner, something defined, and he brushed away more dirt, revealing what looked like the outline of a rectangular frame set directly into the rock itself, not bolted on, not loosely placed, but embedded, deliberate, concealed with purpose. "This is not recent," he murmured, more certain now, his voice steady but quieter, because something about the structure demanded it, as if raising his voice would disturb more than just the air. He shifted his weight, pulling a small folding tool from his pocket, the kind he carried out of habit more than need, and began to clear the remaining soil along the lower edge, each movement slow, methodical, revealing inches at a time until the full width of the metal edge stretched across nearly 3 feet of the rock face. The drizzle had nearly stopped now, leaving behind a damp stillness that carried sound differently, sharper, more defined, and when Daniel tapped the metal lightly with the back of his tool, the echo that came back was unmistakable, hollow, contained, as if there was space behind it, real space, not just a pocket in the earth but something enclosed. Rex stood again, stepping closer but not interfering, his nose hovering just inches from the seam, inhaling deeply, then pulling back as if the scent told him more than Daniel could yet understand. Daniel paused, glancing at the surrounding rock once more, and that unease returned, stronger now, because the placement did not make sense, not in the middle of land no one cared about, not hidden behind a natural wall that offered no easy access, and yet it was here. Built with intention, sealed with care, and forgotten or perhaps deliberately left behind. He pressed his palm flat against the metal again, this time applying more pressure, testing it, feeling for any give, any shift, but it held firm, cold and unyielding, and for a moment he considered walking away, marking the location, coming back with proper tools, with light, with preparation, but the thought did not sit right. Not with Rex watching him like that, not with the sense that whatever was behind this had already waited long enough. "We just take a look," he said, quieter than before, almost like a promise rather than a decision, and Rex's ears flicked forward in response. Daniel slid his fingers along the edge until they found a slight indentation near the right side, subtle, easy to miss, but once his hand settled there, it felt different, smoother, worn in a way the rest of the metal was not, and he hesitated, breath catching just slightly as that old instinct surfaced again, the one that warned him when something simple might not be simple at all. The wind had completely died now, leaving the canyon in a strange, suspended silence, and even the distant sounds of shifting rock and rustling brush seemed to fall away, as if the entire place was holding its breath with him. Slowly, deliberately, Daniel pressed inward on the indentation, not forcing it, just enough to test, and for a split second nothing happened, just the steady pressure of his hand against cold metal, and then, beneath his palm, something shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough, a faint internal movement, a quiet mechanical response that sent a sharp, unmistakable chill down his spine. Rex stiffened instantly, stepping back half a pace, his posture alert but not fearful, as if he had expected this all along. Daniel did not pull his hand away, but his eyes narrowed, focus sharpening as the realization settled in, because natural rock did not move, and forgotten structures did not respond, not unless they had been designed to, and whatever lay behind that wall was not just hidden. It was meant to stay that way until someone found the exact place to press, and somehow, against all odds, he just had. Daniel felt it before he saw it, that subtle shift beneath his hand turning into something more definite, a quiet internal release that did not belong to stone or earth, and he slowly eased his fingers back as if the surface might respond again if he pushed too far, too fast. The rock face remained still for a breath, then another, and for a moment he wondered if he had imagined it. If the tension in his chest had created something that was not truly there, but then a thin line of darkness appeared along the seam, so narrow it could have been mistaken for shadow, except it was growing, slowly, steadily, as if the wall itself was separating from within. Rex stepped back another pace, his body angled forward, ready, watching with an intensity that made the air feel tighter, more focused, and Daniel found himself mirroring that posture without thinking, shoulders squared, weight balanced, every sense narrowing to the space in front of him. The sound came next, not loud, not dramatic, just a soft, controlled slide, metal moving against hidden tracks or mechanisms buried deep inside the rock. The kind of sound designed not to draw attention, and yet in the silence of the canyon it felt impossibly clear, like a whisper that carried farther than it should. The gap widened to an inch, then two, revealing only darkness beyond, not the shallow darkness of a crack or hollow, but something deeper, something that absorbed the light rather than reflecting it. Daniel's breath slowed, deliberate, his eyes adjusting as he leaned slightly closer without crossing the threshold, because every instinct told him this was not a place to rush into, not a place to enter without understanding what waited inside. "Easy," he said under his breath, not to calm Rex, but to steady himself, and the words seemed to settle into the space between them, grounding the moment just enough to keep it from slipping into something uncontrolled. The opening stopped moving as suddenly as it had started, leaving a narrow vertical gap just wide enough to see past the surface layer of rock, and Daniel crouched slightly, angling his head to catch what little light filtered in from the overcast sky. At first there was nothing but darkness, thick and uniform, but as his eyes adjusted he began to make out shapes, not clear, not fully defined, just edges, lines that suggested structure rather than chaos, straight angles where there should have been none, and a faint reflection deeper inside, something smooth, something man-made. Rex let out a low, steady breath, then took a single step forward, stopping just short of the opening, his nose lifting slightly as if testing the air that drifted out from within, and Daniel noticed it too now, that faint, enclosed scent, dry and still, untouched by weather, untouched by time in a way that made it feel preserved rather than abandoned. He reached toward the edge of the opening again, fingers hovering just short of contact, then resting lightly against the metal as he tested it, and it did not resist, did not close, did not react further, as if whatever mechanism had been triggered had completed its purpose and now simply waited. "All right," he whispered, the words barely forming in the damp air. And this time there was no attempt to convince himself it was nothing, no effort to explain it away, because explanation had already fallen behind what he was seeing. He shifted his weight forward, just enough to peer deeper through the gap, and that was when he saw it clearly for the first time, a surface inside, smooth and flat, running parallel to the opening, like an inner wall set a few feet back, and on it, faint but unmistakable, markings, not random, not natural, but deliberate. Faded symbols or letters that had once been clear and now lingered like echoes of intention. Daniel's chest tightened, not from fear, but from recognition of something larger than the moment, something that connected this hidden place to a purpose he did not yet understand, and he pulled back slightly, just enough to take in the full frame again, the rock, the metal, the impossible seam that had opened under his hand. Rex turned his head toward him then, meeting his eyes for the first time since the wall had moved, and in that look there was no confusion, no hesitation, only a steady, unwavering focus, as if the next step had already been decided long before Daniel arrived, and now all that remained was whether he was willing to take it. Daniel did not step inside, not yet, even though every part of him leaned toward the opening, drawn by the quiet pull of something unfinished, something waiting just beyond the narrow gap, and instead he shifted back half a step, letting the moment breathe, letting the reality of what he had just uncovered settle into place. The canyon remained still, the drizzle now reduced to a faint mist that clung to the rocks and softened the edges of everything around him, and for the first time since the wall had moved, he became aware of how exposed he was, standing in open land with something hidden now partially revealed behind him. Rex turned his head sharply toward the ridge line, ears flicking as if catching a distant sound, and Daniel followed his gaze instinctively, scanning the horizon where gray sky met jagged stone, but there was nothing there, no movement, no sign of anyone else, just the quiet weight of distance, and yet the feeling lingered, that subtle awareness that once something hidden is found, it is no longer entirely yours alone. "We are not rushing this," Daniel said quietly, more grounded now, the words steady, deliberate, as if setting a boundary not just for Rex, but for himself. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small flashlight, the beam narrow but strong, and for a moment he hesitated before turning it on, the simple act of adding light to that darkness feeling like a decision that could not be undone. Then he clicked it forward, the white beam cutting cleanly through the dim air and slipping through the opening. The light traveled only a few feet before striking the inner surface he had glimpsed earlier, revealing it more clearly now, a flat wall set back roughly 3 feet from the outer entrance, smooth and uniform, with faint markings that looked less like decoration and more like information, lines and symbols arranged with purpose, worn but still present. Daniel leaned slightly closer, angling the light to trace along the surface, and the more he saw, the more his expression shifted, not into fear, but into recognition of something structured, something organized, as if this place had not been built randomly, but with intent that extended beyond simple storage or concealment. Rex lowered his head, stepping closer again, his body now positioned between Daniel and the open land behind them, not blocking, not aggressive, just present, aware, as if guarding the space while Daniel focused forward. The beam of light caught something else then. Lower on the inner wall, a small panel or plate partially obscured by dust and time, and Daniel narrowed his eyes, adjusting the angle until the reflection sharpened just enough to make out its edges, rectangular, metallic, similar in tone to the outer frame but more refined, more deliberate. He exhaled slowly, the air steady, controlled, and shifted his stance, bringing himself closer to the opening without fully crossing into it, because something about that threshold still held weight, still demanded respect. "There is more to this," he said under his breath, not as a question, not as speculation, but as a quiet acknowledgement of fact. The light flickered slightly as a drop of water slid across the lens, distorting the beam for a split second, and in that brief shift, Daniel caught a glimpse deeper inside, past the inner wall, through what looked like a narrow passage or offset opening, and the realization came sharp and immediate. This was not a single chamber, not just a sealed space, it continued beyond what he could see from here. Rex let out a low, steady breath again, then glanced back at Daniel, his eyes steady, focused, and Daniel met that look with one of his own. The silent exchange carrying more weight than words could, because whatever lay beyond that wall had already begun to unfold, and stepping away now would not undo what had been set in motion. He straightened slightly, tightening his grip on the flashlight, and took one small step forward, just enough to bring his shoulder level with the edge of the opening. The beam of light now angled deeper into the space ahead, and for a moment, everything narrowed again to that single line between outside and inside, between known and unknown, and Daniel Hayes understood, with quiet certainty, that crossing it would change everything that came after. Daniel did not rush the step, even as the pull of the unknown pressed quietly against him, steady and persistent, because years of training had taught him that the moment before crossing a threshold was often the most important one, the moment where instinct either sharpened or failed, and he was not about to let it fail now. He angled the flashlight again, sweeping the beam slowly across the inner wall, taking in every detail he could from the outside, committing the layout to memory before moving forward, the faint markings now clearer under the steady light, not random scratches, not decorative lines, but structured symbols, arranged in rows that suggested labeling, identification, something meant to be read or understood by someone who knew what to look for. Rex stepped closer, his shoulder brushing lightly against Daniel's leg, grounding him in a way that words never could, and Daniel rested a brief hand against the dog's neck, not for comfort, but for connection, a silent acknowledgement that they were moving into this together. "Stay with me," he said quietly, the words calm and measured, and Rex responded not with sound, but with presence, shifting his weight forward in sync. Daniel leaned into the opening, just enough to test the space, then stepped through, one controlled movement, his boots crossing from damp earth onto a surface that felt different immediately, firm and level beneath his feet, not natural ground, but something placed, constructed. The air changed as well, cooler, still, carrying that same enclosed scent he had noticed before, untouched by weather, untouched by time in a way that made the space feel preserved rather than abandoned. He paused just inside, turning slightly to scan the edges of the entrance from within, noting how the outer rock concealed the frame completely from this angle, how the mechanism sat hidden behind layers that gave no hint of what lay beneath, and the precision of it all settled deeper into his awareness. This had not been built casually, this had been designed to remain unseen. Rex followed without hesitation, stepping through the gap and immediately lowering his head, his nose tracing along the floor, then lifting again as he took in the space ahead, his movement slower now, more deliberate, as if every sense was engaged at once. Daniel raised the flashlight, the beam cutting across the inner wall he had seen from outside, revealing more of the markings now that he stood closer, and he moved toward it carefully, each step measured. The sound of his boots muted against the solid surface, the symbols were clearer up close, not letters he recognized at first glance, but structured enough to suggest meaning, and beneath them, that rectangular plate he had glimpsed earlier, set at about waist height, its surface dulled by time but still intact. He reached out, brushing a thin layer of dust away with the back of his hand, and as the particles shifted, the surface beneath caught the light differently, revealing faint etched lines, not random, but organized, possibly numbers, possibly codes, and his brow tightened slightly as he leaned closer, trying to make sense of them. Behind him, the opening remained unchanged, the narrow gap still letting in a thin slice of gray daylight, but beyond that, the canyon felt distant now. Muted, as if the space he had entered existed on its own terms, separate from the world outside. Rex turned his head sharply again, but this time not toward the entrance, instead toward the deeper part of the structure, the area Daniel had only briefly glimpsed through that offset passage, and he took a step in that direction, then paused, looking back at Daniel as if waiting for confirmation. Daniel followed the line of his gaze, lifting the flashlight and angling it past the inner wall, searching for that secondary opening, and there it was, partially obscured from this angle, a narrow passage extending beyond the first chamber, just wide enough for a person to pass through, the darkness within it deeper, more complete, absorbing the light in a way that suggested it stretched farther than he could see. His chest tightened slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of realization. This was not just a hidden room. It was a path, something that led somewhere, something that had been built to be accessed by those who knew how, and hidden from everyone else. He straightened, shifting his grip on the flashlight, the beam steady again as he looked from the markings on the wall to the passage ahead, then down to Rex, whose posture had not changed, still alert, still focused, as if the direction forward had already been decided. Daniel exhaled slowly, the sound quiet but steady in the enclosed space, and for a brief moment he allowed himself to acknowledge the truth of it. That whatever this place was, whatever it had been used for, he was no longer just standing at the edge of it, he was inside it now, and the only way to understand it was to keep going. Daniel did not answer. The question forming in his own mind, because the moment he focused on it too clearly, it would become something heavier than he was ready to carry, so instead he shifted his attention forward, lifting the beam of the flashlight and letting it settle on the narrow passage ahead, the edges of it sharp and deliberate, carved or constructed with the same precision as the chamber behind him. Rex moved first, not rushing, not hesitant, just steady, his paws making almost no sound against the solid surface as he stepped toward the opening and paused just before entering, his head slightly lowered, ears forward, listening for something beyond what Daniel could hear. The silence inside the structure deepened as they approached, not empty, but dense, as if the air itself held memory, and Daniel felt that familiar tightening in his chest again, not fear, but awareness, the kind that sharpened his senses and slowed his movements. Each step calculated, each breath controlled. "We move slow," he said quietly, the words barely carrying past his own position, but Rex responded all the same, stepping into the passage with deliberate care. Daniel followed, the beam of light cutting into the darkness ahead, revealing walls that were smoother than the outer chamber, less worn, as if this section had been protected more completely from time, the passage just wide enough for one person at a time, forcing him into a single file line behind the dog. The temperature dropped slightly as they moved deeper, the air cooler, more still, and Daniel became aware of how completely cut off they were from the outside now, the faint light from the entrance fading behind them until it was nothing more than a distant suggestion. The beam of the flashlight traveled along the walls, catching subtle details, faint seams, small embedded panels that blended almost seamlessly into the structure, each one reinforcing the same conclusion. This place had been designed with intention, with layers, with control. Rex slowed near a bend in the passage, stopping just before it, his body angled slightly as he listened. Then he glanced back at Daniel, holding that look for a brief second, and Daniel nodded once, a silent acknowledgement. Before stepping closer, he shifted the flashlight to his left hand and reached out with his right, brushing his fingers lightly along the wall as he moved forward, grounding himself in the physical space, confirming that everything he felt matched what he saw, that nothing here was illusion or trick of the light. The passage curved gently to the right, and as the beam followed that curve, the space beyond began to open, not suddenly, but gradually, the walls pulling back just enough to suggest a larger area ahead. Rex stepped forward again, crossing the bend, and Daniel followed immediately, the light spilling into the next section and revealing a wider chamber, larger than the first, the ceiling slightly higher, the floor extending several feet in each direction before meeting walls that held the same smooth, constructed finish. Daniel stopped at the threshold of this new space, his breath steady but slower now, taking it in piece by piece, the beam of the flashlight sweeping across the room in controlled arcs, and then it caught something that made him pause completely. Along the far wall, partially obscured by shadow, were structures, not large, not imposing, but unmistakably intentional, rectangular forms set into the wall at even intervals, their surfaces flat and uniform, like compartments or sealed sections, each one identical in size and placement. Rex moved toward them without hesitation, his pace measured, his focus unwavering, and Daniel followed, each step bringing the shapes into clearer view, each detail sharpening under the light. The compartments were closed, their surfaces seamless except for faint outlines that marked their edges, and as Daniel approached, he noticed the same kind of markings he had seen before, positioned above each section, worn but still visible, consistent in pattern, consistent in placement. He raised the flashlight higher, angling it to illuminate the full row, counting them without meaning. 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, more extending beyond the edge of the beam, and the realization settled in slowly, not all at once, but in layers. This was not storage, not random, this was organized, categorized, preserved. Rex stopped in front of one of the compartments and lowered his head, his nose hovering just inches from the surface. Then he sat, looking back at Daniel again, that same steady, unwavering gaze, as if to say this is where it matters. Daniel stepped closer, his boots quiet against the floor, his free hand lifting slowly toward the surface of the compartment, fingers hovering just short of contact as the weight of the moment settled fully into place, because whatever this place had been built for, whatever had been sealed away behind these walls, he was no longer just discovering it, he was about to interact with it, and there would be no going back after that. Daniel let his hand rest against the surface at last, not pressing, not forcing, just making contact, and the moment his skin touched the metal, a subtle vibration ran through it, so faint it could have been imagined, except Rex reacted instantly, his ears snapping forward, his body tensing as if he had felt it too. Daniel held still, his breath slowing again, his focus narrowing to the point of contact. And for a second nothing else happened, just that quiet connection between him and something that had been sealed for who knew how long, and then his fingers shifted slightly, tracing along the edge until they found another indentation, smaller than the one at the entrance, almost hidden within the design. Of course, he murmured, not surprised now, not really, because everything about this place suggested layers, control, intention, and he pressed inward gently, careful, deliberate, ready for resistance. But the response came almost immediately, a soft internal click, followed by a smooth release that traveled through the surface beneath his hand. The compartment did not swing open or fall outward, instead it slid, just a few inches at first, then farther, revealing a narrow interior space lit only by the beam of his flashlight, the movement controlled and silent, as if it had been designed to operate without drawing attention even in complete stillness. Rex stepped closer but did not interfere, his nose hovering near the opening, his posture alert but restrained, as if he understood the importance of not disturbing what was inside. Daniel leaned slightly forward, angling the light into the compartment, and what he saw did not overwhelm him all at once. It revealed itself in pieces, shapes resolving slowly as his eyes adjusted, edges sharpening under the steady beam. Inside, resting on a flat internal shelf, was an object, not large, not ornate, but carefully placed, centered within the space as if it mattered exactly where it sat. Daniel's brow tightened slightly as he studied it, the form familiar in a distant way, something he recognized not from memory of place, but from experience, from a life that had trained him to notice details others might miss. He reached in slowly, pausing just short of touching it, letting the light settle fully before making any move, and the object resolved into clearer definition, a metal case, roughly the size of a small field notebook, its surface worn but intact, edges reinforced, a simple latch mechanism visible along one side. It was not random, not personal in the casual sense, it was functional, deliberate, something meant to store information or materials that needed to be protected. Rex let out a quiet breath, then sat again, watching Daniel with that same steady focus, as if this was the moment he had been leading toward from the beginning. Daniel's hand hovered for another second, then moved, fingers closing gently around the case, lifting it with care, testing its weight, solid, balanced, heavier than it looked, but not by much, and he drew it out of the compartment slowly, bringing it into the open light. The compartment behind it remained still, empty now except for the imprint where the case had rested, and as soon as it cleared the threshold, the panel slid back into place on its own, sealing with the same quiet precision as before, leaving no visible gap, no sign that it had ever been opened. Daniel did not react to that, not outwardly, because his focus had shifted entirely to what he now held in his hands, the metal cool against his skin, the surface marked with faint scratches that suggested use, not neglect. He turned it slightly, angling it toward the light, and that was when he saw it. Etched faintly along the top, worn but still legible enough to make out, a series of characters, not random, not decorative, but structured in a way that made his chest tighten just slightly. He did not read them out loud, did not need to, because recognition did not always require full clarity. Sometimes it came from pattern, from familiarity, from something deeper than conscious thought, and whatever this case was, wherever it had come from, it connected to something he had not expected to find here. Rex shifted again, stepping closer to Daniel's side, his presence steady, grounding, as Daniel held the case for a moment longer, then slowly, carefully, moved his thumb toward the latch, the small mechanism that separated what was visible from what was still hidden, and for a brief second he hesitated, not out of fear, but out of understanding, because opening it would not just reveal its contents, it would confirm that this place, this structure, this discovery, was not an accident. And whatever truth lay inside was about to step fully into the light. Daniel did not open it immediately, even though his thumb rested against the latch and every instinct pushed him forward, because something deeper, quieter, held him still for just a moment longer, a final pause before the line between unknown and known disappeared completely. Rex stood close at his side, not looking at the case, but at Daniel, his presence steady and grounded. As if the decision mattered more than the discovery itself, Daniel exhaled slowly, his breath controlled, then pressed the latch. The sound was soft, a clean metallic release that echoed just slightly in the stillness of the chamber, and the lid shifted upward under his fingers, opening with a resistance that suggested it had not been moved in a very long time, yet still functioned perfectly, as if time had been accounted for in its design. He angled the flashlight downward, letting the beam fall into the open case, and for a second the contents remained indistinct, shapes layered in shadow, until the light settled and everything came into focus. Inside, neatly secured, were documents, not loose, not scattered, but organized, held in place by a fitted interior that kept them aligned, preserved, protected, and Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly as he leaned closer, recognizing the structure immediately, the careful arrangement, the deliberate preservation. This was not personal storage, this was archival. He lifted the top sheet carefully, the material firm, not brittle, designed to endure, and as he turned it toward the light, the markings became clear enough to read. Structured text, official in tone, formatted with precision, and beneath it, diagrams, clean lines, labeled sections, something technical, something engineered. His jaw tightened slightly, not from confusion, but from recognition of a different kind, not memory exactly, but familiarity with the way information like this was recorded, the way it was meant to be understood only by those who knew how to read it. He did not read every word, did not need to, because certain elements stood out immediately, patterns, headings, identifiers that suggested classification rather than casual record, and the weight of it settled into his chest, steady and undeniable. Rex shifted his stance slightly, turning his head toward the deeper part of the chamber again, then back to Daniel, as if reminding him that the discovery in his hands was only part of something larger. Daniel lowered the document back into the case with care, not out of reluctance, but out of respect for what it represented, then reached further inside, lifting a second item, smaller. A sealed envelope or packet, its surface marked with the same style of etching as the case itself, consistent, deliberate. He turned it under the light, studying it, and this time the recognition came sharper, more immediate, not from the text itself, but from the format, the way it was labeled, the way it was intended to be handled, and something in his expression shifted, subtle but real. As if a piece of the puzzle had just aligned with something he had carried without knowing it. The chamber around him remained still, unchanged, the rows of sealed compartments stretching into shadow, the passage behind him quiet and narrow, the outside world distant and irrelevant for the moment, because everything had condensed into this single point, this case, this discovery, this connection that was no longer abstract. Daniel closed the lid slowly, the metal settling back into place with the same quiet precision, and held the case for a moment longer, its weight steady in his hands, before lowering it slightly, his gaze lifting toward the deeper darkness of the chamber. This was not forgotten, he said quietly, the words firm now. Certain, no longer speculation, no longer guesswork, but conclusion. Rex stood beside him, unmoving, his presence unwavering, as Daniel took a slow step back, then another, not retreating, but repositioning, creating space to think, to understand, to decide what came next, because whatever this place had been built for, whatever had been sealed within it, it had not simply been left behind, it had been preserved, protected, waiting for someone who could recognize its meaning. And now that someone was here, standing in the quiet center of it, holding the first piece of a truth that was far from complete, and the path forward was no longer hidden, it was simply deeper.